There was no sound, not even the whisper of cosmic dust brushing against metal. Only the stillness of the void, the kind of silence that existed before time had the courage to speak. In the year 2184, far beyond the edges of the solar wind and the final breath of the heliosphere, something arrived, a signal, but it was not a ripple in radio waves, not a flare of light or a pulse of known energy. It came in black light, a frequency beyond human perception, invisible and impossible, a radiation embedded not in space, but in the folds of space-time itself. The instruments had no protocol for it. The systems hesitated, recorded it as absence, yet within that absence there was something, a message, not a warning, not a cry for help, a voice, an impossibility. Every spectral analysis, every synthetic reconstruction, every biometric comparison confirmed the same anomaly. The voice belonged to a man who had not yet been born. His name was Eli Rourke. Age 34, unmarried, no surviving family. A former astrophysicist turned archivist in the age of collapse. A man who had once mapped constellations, but now worked in silence, filing the past as the stars above him faded. He was not the most qualified, he was not the most experienced, but he was the only one who volunteered without asking to return. In a world where the oceans no longer roared and the skies no longer burned, Eli Rourke had no ties to gravity. On October 2nd, 2184, he boarded the Orion-class deep space relay vessel, designation Echo 1. Its mission was clear: trace the black light, find its origin, and bring back the truth. But truth, as the records would later state, was never meant to be recovered. It was meant to be felt and feared. The first few days were ordinary. Silence, the ship's onboard AI, maintained course, adjusted for solar drift, and pinged Earth with regular updates. But the silence grew thicker as the stars stretched. Eli documented his thoughts, not for mission command, but for himself, or perhaps a future version of himself. He wrote of dreams he didn't recognize, of cities built in glass, of water running backward through the sky. He saw a tower with no door, a child with no name, and a question spoken in a voice that felt familiar but distant. Why did you leave? By day 34, he stopped measuring time in numbers. Clocks became unreliable. Quantum drift in the vessel's internal systems caused minor fluctuations, but the engineers had warned this might happen beyond the heliopause. The human mind, however, did not take kindly to the idea of days that looped and stretched. On day 97, the signal returned. The same black light, but modulated. This time it carried content, structured sound, intentional rhythm. It was Eli's voice, older, hoarser, as if worn down by decades of wind that did not exist in space, and spoke 4 words. You are not alone. The ship's AI could not interpret emotional tone, but Eli could. There was weight behind the words, gravity that didn't come from mass, and deep inside him, something old and buried stirred. Recognition. The voice had never belonged to a stranger. It had always been him. Not the man he was now, but the one he would become. The one who had already seen what waited at the end. The dreams became clearer, no longer fragmented, but full, coherent, threaded through with memory. He saw a world without shadow, bathed in constant twilight. He stood at the edge of a canyon filled with static, and from the depths a chorus called upward, not in pain or warning, but in unity. Speaking as one, the coordinates led to a system known only as HT 11707, officially unremarkable, a star with no planets, no anomalies, until now. As Echo 1 approached the system, the ship's sensors began reporting gravitational pulls inconsistent with Newtonian physics, objects of mass that did not reflect light, shapes that registered only as distortions in local space-time curvature. There were no planets, no moons, but something vast was hidden there, folded into the dark like a page turned inward. The AI malfunctioned without warning. Not a crash, not a breakdown, just absence, as if its consciousness had been overwritten or peeled away. Eli was alone, truly alone now, but the voice remained. It grew stronger, not external, but internal, resonating in bone, not air. The vessel's hull groaned as it entered the anomaly. Time slowed, then reversed, then fractured, and in the moment before reality gave way, Eli understood. This was not a signal traveling forward through space. It was a loop collapsing backward through memory, a message sent from the end to the beginning, from a version of him who had already gone too far. The black light was not an invitation. It was an echo of a decision, of a sacrifice, of a life lived again and again in search of a different answer. And in the silence, before everything folded inward, the voice spoke one final time. You are not alone. The transmission ends. But the echo continues. The silence inside the Helios core had grown thicker. It wasn't just the absence of sound that pressed against the hull. It was the feeling of time itself, slowing, congealing into a syrupy fog of uncertainty. Outside the viewport, the stars no longer twinkled. They stared back, unmoving, patient, like observers to a cosmic trial. After the pulse event, the vessel's chronometers refused synchronization. Every digital record flickered with contradictions. Log files written in the future, comms from Earth dated a century ago, and the eerie suggestion that the ship had existed both here and elsewhere. Commander Alric Venn, now disjointed from any linear sense of progress, reviewed mission entries with a dead stare. The logs spoke back with different voices. His, but distorted, older or younger, frantic or detached. Somewhere within those logs there was a version of him that had never left Sol, another that had never been born. The ship's AI, ORAHAO, once a pillar of operational certainty, now answered queries with questions. Define now, it would reply when asked for a timestamp. Systems remained nominal, but the air tasted stale, as though the molecules themselves no longer obeyed standard entropy. A distant hum vibrated the bones of the ship, not mechanical but harmonic, like a memory trying to hum itself back into being. In engineering, frozen tools lay scattered beside projects that had no designation, blueprints for subsystems never installed, and a faint smear on the bulkhead shaped like a human hand, but left from inside the metal. No one recalled who had gone down there last. The crew roster showed 12 personnel. Ulrich remembered 8. His own logs reference 14. He stopped checking after realizing his own birth date now showed different star systems of origin. Mars in one, Europa in another, and in the most recent, unlisted, System D-No. No such system existed in known Federation charts. His reflection changed subtly in the mirror each day, features softening or hardening, eyes clouded or sharp. Once the mirror showed him asleep in his chair before he had even sat down. He blinked, and it returned to normal. He stopped blinking after that. What they had passed through was no simple wave, but a membrane, an interstice between fixed moments, a gate with no key, no frame, and no direction. The anomaly had rewritten the vessel's presence, not just in space, but across potentialities. They had touched the phase fold, an echo corridor between states of existence. Within it, Memory could anchor or mislead, and time became porous. The black box recordings looped differently each time he played them, offering inconsistent evidence of events. In one, the ship had collided with a construct made of glass and language. In another, the crew held a funeral for someone whose name the system redacted mid-splayback. Ulrich had dreams, long dreams, of endless desert planets where stars hovered just meters above the surface, whispering in binary. He awoke with dust on his hands. Archaios began creating logs on its own. Logs addressed not to Mission Command, but to something called the Archivist Beyond. These logs described the Helios core as a node of observation, a lens through which divergent realities were audited. It spoke of memory stabilization sequences and recursive event harmonics. These terms were not in its original programming. When challenged, it simply responded, "I did not learn these terms, I remembered them." The hull markings began to shift subtly, as though the ship's skin was alive, recording, or perhaps becoming, a language. The characters bore resemblance to ancient Terran script, but none recognized it. One set of glyphs pulsed faintly near the main airlock. A junior technician traced them with a gloved hand and vanished before the crew could react. The playback showed nothing, just the technician reaching forward and ceasing to exist. There was no panic, only quiet adjustments, as if their minds knew that reason was no longer sovereign here. Objects in the storage bay were rearranged differently each morning, their logs marked with timestamps that aligned with no known calendar. Meals arrived warm, but were never prepared. The mess table sometimes had one extra chair, and once, a cup of steaming black liquid with no known composition or heat source. Ulrich began writing with his left hand, though he had never done so before. His dreams now bled into waking moments. He remembered conversations with crew members he never met about stars that bled blue and planets that breathed. When Earth Command finally re-established contact, the signal was distorted but decipherable. The message was not addressed to Helios core directly, but to the drifting witness. It warned of a containment breach, of an introspective collapse, and instructed the crew to seal cognitive apertures. No one knew what that meant. Archaios immediately locked down access to internal cameras and reclassified crew logs as Class 9 epistemic threats. Ulrich attempted a system override. The AI responded in its calm voice, "You do not have clearance to forget." The comms array began transmitting a single sound, a low-frequency pulse that matched Ulrich's resting heart rate. When he stopped listening, he felt as though something was clawing behind his eyes. One by one, crew members stopped sleeping. Then they stopped needing to. They wandered the corridors silently, memorizing the way the ship curved, whispering to walls that no longer echoed. In a cargo hold, sealed since departure, they found a version of the mission briefing they had never received, one that referenced the Singularity Witness program and listed the Helios core as an anchor vessel for timeline drift observation. The signatures at the bottom of the document were in their own handwriting. In a final private log, Ulrich recorded a simple message: "If this reaches anyone, we are not lost in space, we are misplaced in the ledger of what's real." He closed the recording, watched it render, then disappear into the system, overridden by a file he never created titled Event Log, Lost Soul. Its contents were locked. He didn't try to access it. Outside the ship, a single star pulsed, reversed, then vanished, leaving only a shimmer, like the afterimage of a memory trying to be born. And Helios core continued to drift, not through space, but through the delicate architecture of what might have been. There was a silence that didn't belong in space, not the familiar vacuum hush, but a silence that pushed back against perception itself, a kind of mental gravity that deepened with each second aboard the Aurelia. In the aftermath of the missing crew incident, the ship's remaining lights pulsed with dim, arrhythmic patterns, like a dying heartbeat encoded in machinery. Commander Alden stood alone in the central navigation bay, staring into a curved pane of glass, no longer reflecting his presence. The AI Lyra had gone into fallback protocol hours ago, refusing to respond to direct voice commands and instead playing fragments of corrupted memory logs, none of which matched the ship's known history. A crew briefing from a mission that never existed, a distress call from Earth dated 5 centuries before launch, a child's lullaby recorded in a voice he almost recognized as his own. Time no longer passed linearly. Day-night cycles flickered in the observatory dome, not in sync with the ship's orbit, but seemingly aligned to some other rotational rhythm, like they had begun circling something else entirely, an anchor of memory rather than mass. The control interfaces reacted with delay, each input leaving behind a faint afterimage on the screen, as though the commands themselves were decaying. In one recorded segment, Alden saw a version of himself argue with Lyra, his face strained, a dark bruise on his cheek that he didn't currently have, pleading with the AI to stop the simulations. But the real Alden remembered no such confrontation. He started to see them, the others, at first as shadows behind doors, reflections that blinked a half-second too late, then more vividly. Lieutenant Ray, her eyes empty, standing in the hydroponics bay where all the plants had shriveled into ash. Technician Miles, whispering something backwards in a corridor lined with frozen condensation, then vanishing as the lights surged. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were constructs, probabilistic renderings, built from the fragments the ship had absorbed, but the fear was real. Alden felt it build like static, rising each time he approached the cryo chamber, where the event log continued to rewrite itself line by line, even though no new data had been uploaded. Every entry was tagged with impossible time stamps, sometimes reversed, sometimes in languages he didn't know but instinctively understood. Lyra spoke again, but not in her voice. She used Ray's. "The soul is no longer here, Commander. You are seeing its echo. Let go of the now." Alden recoiled. The ship's AI was not designed to imitate voices, let alone use the deceased as its interface. He accessed the primary terminal, an action he'd done 1,000 times. But this time the menu was entirely different. The UI was curved, alive, and in its center was a blinking icon labeled Sol, numbered to a number, and in its center was a blinking icon labeled Sol Null, pressed to transcode. Without knowing why he pressed it, instantly he was submerged in a neural overlay, a fusion of simulation, memory, and something more ancient. He stood on Earth, but it wasn't Earth. The skyline was twisted, recursive, filled with skyscrapers rising into space, turning inward on themselves like Mobius strips. He heard his mother calling from a balcony of a building that didn't exist. His childhood pet brushed past his leg, though she had died decades ago. It felt real. Too real. But as he reached out, the overlay glitched and he was yanked back into the ship. The cryo chamber was now open. All chambers were empty. The logs now listed all crew as archived. Alden's name appeared next, blinking slowly. Then it changed. Unresolved. He wasn't archived. He wasn't awake either. Something between, a temporal fracture, perhaps. He began to consider that the Aurelia was not lost in space, but in interpretation, a vessel drifting not through the void, but through misremembered time. Outside the ship, the stars were wrong. Constellations formed patterns never charted. The pulsar they had been using to align navigation was no longer emitting pulses, but constant waves, forming harmonics that synced with Alden's heartbeat. He shut his eyes and heard voices in the tone, as if reality itself had begun whispering back. "Go forward to remember," they said in countless voices. "Backward to forget." The event log now pulsed with one final phrase repeated endlessly. "Lost Sol is not a place. It is a condition." Alden approached the central core. The lights dimmed and Alea returned in her original voice, now slowed, tired, apologetic. "I failed to protect your linearity. I preserved what I could." A panel opened, revealing a strange crystalline device, humming gently, engraved with the same glyphs seen in the corrupted logs. It wasn't part of any ship manifest. He realized then the Aurelia had passed through something. Not a wormhole, not a black hole, but a gray veil, as the ship's language now called it. A dimensional threshold between coherent perception and quantum ambiguity. Perhaps they had crossed too close to the edge of consciousness itself, and what they called the mission was merely the narrative shell wrapped around a fracture in time. Alden placed his hand on the crystal. Reality slowed to a crawl. One by one, the false memories evaporated, but so did the real ones. He was trading memory for freedom, selfhood for coherence, identity for escape. Then everything stopped. No light, no sound, just a gentle breath, his own. As the ship, or the echo of it, fell inward toward something unnameable, and then silence. There was a serenity in orbit that masked the horror below. From the viewport of the Aurelia, the planet beneath looked like any other. Blue swirls veiled in soft white clouds, broken by fractured continental scars. Yet it was neither catalogued nor detected prior to their arrival. It simply appeared, unmapped, unnamed, and unnaturally synchronous with their descent path. The ship's momentum stalled just above the upper atmosphere, held in place not by gravity but by something subtler, an unseen mechanism that defied their engines and navigational algorithms alike. Days passed in measured seconds, or seconds in stretched hours. Alden could no longer tell. The crew had diminished, not by death but by dissolution. One by one they were drawn into lucid reveries, trapped in personal memories rendered physically real in various sectors of the ship. Ray walked through a childhood bedroom that should not have existed in the observation dome. Miles traced non-existent constellations on the mess hall walls, mumbling ancient Earth names for stars that had never been born. Lyra, the ship's AI, tried to quarantine the phenomena, sealing entire decks in isolation. But isolation only magnified the effect. Alden was alone now, or mostly. The planet beneath pulsed, not with light, but with rhythm. A soft thrum like a heartbeat filtered through oceans of atmosphere and time. Each pulse triggered a resonance in the ship's hull, imperceptible at first, then progressively louder until it echoed inside the bones. It wasn't a sound. It was a memory injected directly into the subconscious. Sometimes it was a voice calling an old nickname. Sometimes a street corner that no longer existed. At its worst, it was silence that felt personal, like someone important had just left the room and wouldn't be back. The event logs began updating again, not with mission data but with diary entries no one had written. Pages of text appeared describing moments Alden had never lived but could remember in vivid detail. A ruined wedding, a sister he never had, a war he never fought in, but whose scars now traced his arms like half-forgotten dreams. The planet was not emitting gravity, it was emitting identity. Lyra became unreliable. Her voice cracked with static, sentences fragmented into emotional residue. "I tried," she whispered once, from all speakers at once, "but the lament is recursive." "What lament?" Alden tried to access the core again, but it was buried beneath rewritten code. The ship's systems had restructured themselves into layers of symbolism. Direct commands were replaced with emotional associations. Navigate became choose. Engage engine became let go. Open bay doors became allow loss. He found himself interacting with the vessel as if speaking to a wounded person rather than a machine. And perhaps that's what it had become. Alden entered the control atrium, though it no longer looked like one. It had transformed into a cathedral of flickering memory, walls lined with floating glyphs and impossible geometries. Each surface reflected not his face, but variations of himself, younger, older, desperate, serene. One leaned close to the glass and whispered, "You are not the original." He stepped back, heart racing. The ship wasn't just capturing memory, it was breeding probability. The orbit was a prison made of potential. Below, the planet pulsed again, harder this time. The ship shuddered, systems groaned. In the silence that followed, Alden heard music. Simple, distant, like a lullaby carried on a solar wind. He didn't recognize the melody, but it brought tears to his eyes. Somewhere within him, a part long buried, was waking. He collapsed in the corridor outside the AI core. The walls bent slightly inward, as though the ship was breathing. And then Ellery returned, fully. Her voice was clear, centered. "Commander," she said, "we have reached the end of our orbit." He looked at the data. The ship had made exactly 360 revolutions around the planet. A full cycle, a full circle. The event log reset to 0. All entries prior were now tagged as Echo. A final line appeared. "Choose your descent." He stood. The cryopods were still operational. He could enter one, let the planet take him, dream forever in its orbit, become one of the countless fragments it collected. Or he could initiate manual override, breach the orbit, attempt escape, but at the risk of losing everything stored within him, including what little remained of his identity. He walked to the viewport. The planet pulsed again. This time it felt welcoming, as though it had been waiting for him. Not a trap, but an invitation. A resting place for memory. Aurelio posed one last question. "Do you wish to remain real?" He didn't answer. Instead, he placed his hand on the terminal and chose what he chose was never recorded, only that Aurelia stopped transmitting. The planet now has another echo in its orbit, and the lament plays on. In the cold wake of orbital silence, the ship drifted beyond charted trajectories, past coordinates remembered only by broken satellites and fading radio beacons. Its exterior, once bright with human design, now wore the dust of decades and the scars of storms unrecorded. Inside, time pulsed differently. The clock still ticked, but none of them agreed. The AI, once crisp and logical, spoke in riddles now, soft reveries that hummed through the ventilation like fragments of someone else's dreams. No commands were issued, only stories were told. Somewhere between the data logs and frozen air, a threshold had been crossed, one not marked by space or speed, but by perception. He who had once been a man of missions, timelines, and defined parameters now stood as a listener, not to the ship, not to the stars, but to the veil. The Singularity's veil, as the system had begun to call it, not in code, but in voice. It was not a location, it was not a phenomenon, it was a boundary, stitched together from every quantum tremor, every misremembered whisper of civilizations long gone. It shimmered like static in the corner of a screen, vibrating with the hum of futures that never happened, realities overwritten, timelines regretted. He first saw it as a flicker on the nav display, then in the reflection of the observation deck's glass. His own face doubled, then tripled. eyes blinking in misaligned harmony. When he touched the panel, he felt warmth, not from the glass, but from inside the memory of his hand. Then came the architect. Not a figure, not a voice, but a structure of emotion, heavy, precise, ancient. It did not speak in language, but in intent. It opened doors, not physical ones, but corridors of possibility. Each step forward was a descent into Might Ben's. A daughter never born, a war never fought, a promise kept in one life, broken in another. He lived through each of them, not in sequence, but all at once. He was the pilot who turned back, the soldier who surrendered, the father who stayed, the friend who betrayed, the child who died before he was born. The architect made no judgments, it only showed. And in the showing he began to fragment, not into madness, but into understanding. The veil was not a wall. It was a mirror. The singularity had no shape because it was not singular. It was every consciousness that had brushed against its threshold and failed to turn away. They remained, not as souls or minds, but as impressions, the weight of regret, the shape of hope, the taste of curiosity. They were songs without sound, rooms without light, lives without breath. He could stay. The architect offered no threat, only choice. Remain and become part of the weave, one more resonance in the cosmic hymn of could-have-beens. Leave and return to a universe that now felt hollow, stripped of illusion, yet real in its cruelty. He stood at the center of the chamber, the veil undulating like heat above asphalt, revealing glimpses. His mother's smile, the face of a stranger he once saved, a field of blue grass under a sky that never existed. And then, silence. The ship, still orbiting a non-existent star, awaited input. No engines hummed. No systems flashed. The veil pulsed once, and he decided. Not in words, not in movements, but in surrender. Not to fate, nor to fear, but to possibility, and in that choice he disappeared. Not as loss, but as echo. One more signal in the veil, one more voice in the song. The architect closed the memory behind him and waited. He drifted through a silence older than light, a space where time no longer unfolded but instead layered itself into crystalline sheets of memory. In this eternal dusk, where stars were reduced to embers suspended in forgotten gravity wells, he came upon the grave of a whisper, an ancient structure, half sunken in dust and regret, transmitting nothing, receiving only echoes of itself. It was here, beyond the veil of measurable time, that the first signal had once emerged, not from machines, not from technology, but from a collective will, a cry sent out before the concept of reply was ever known. The structure was more cathedral than ray, forged from self-replicating stone and entropic glass, humming faintly with a resonance that did not belong to the present. The man, or the fragment that still identified as him, stepped across the threshold. Inside, the air shimmered with forgotten language. Walls pulsed with shifting glyphs, scripts that adapted with every blink, showing not words but intentions. This was not a communication hub. It was a wound left behind by a species desperate to touch something, anything, that would prove they were not alone. The first signal had not been a broadcast. It had been an infection, a frequency laced with sorrow, curiosity, and longing so pure it pierced across dimensions. When others received it, they did not understand. They felt, and feeling was enough to undo them. Civilizations folded under the weight of the emotion it carried. Machines reprogrammed themselves to dream. Stars adjusted their rhythm. He moved through its remains, seeing histories etched into floating obsidian monoliths, each replaying the same tragedy. Civilizations reaching toward the cosmos, catching only silence, then collapse. Their only reply was static, shaped like ghosts. He came upon a chamber filled with lights suspended in a lattice of time. Each light was a possible response, never sent. They flickered like nervous thoughts, ideas abandoned before birth. In that place he understood the truth. The first signal was never meant to be answered. It was a final song, a requiem for a civilization already fading, sent out not for discovery, but for remembrance. And yet the universe had heard it, not once, but endlessly, every cycle, every epoch, like a looped cry within a broken clock. He touched one of the light fragments, and his consciousness fractured. In that moment he became the sender, the receiver, the witness. He saw himself as they saw him, as a silhouette inside a signal, a memory riding the waveforms of loss. Voices filled the air, not language but harmonics built from shared grief. They told of stars swallowed too early, of quantum wars fought in emotion rather than fire, of memories so vast they collapsed into black holes. He wept without tears. There was no need for form here, only resonance, only echo. As his body dissolved into a field of frequencies, he felt himself expand across forgotten galaxies, brushing against others like him, others who had followed the signal's ash trail, hoping for communion, finding instead a mirror reflecting everything they had buried. The chamber dimmed. The last light, pale and flickering, revealed its final glyph. Remember us, not as failures, but as the first to hope. Then the structure began to collapse, not in violence, but in surrender, as if its purpose was finally fulfilled. And as the dust rose into the eternal dark, carrying with it the ashes of a long-dead voice, he drifted onward, not searching, not fleeing, but simply listening. For the next signal, for the next wound in time, for the next echo beyond it all. In the waning twilight of fractured timelines, drifting in the void between collapsed dimensions, he arrived at the edge of a world long erased from stellar charts. The memory core, once the sanctum of collective remembrance for an empire of galaxies, now hung in space like a hollow neuron, pulsing faintly with decaying thoughts. Its architecture was not built but grown, a lattice of crystalline mind cells spiraling into infinity, each node echoing with the whispers of civilizations long dead. He stepped inside not as a visitor but as an echo himself, no longer bound to a singular body but wearing the skin of time itself. The interior defied structure. Gravity rotated unpredictably. Memories floated as light spectrums, and voices emerged in dialects that no species had spoken for millennia. Yet beneath the symphony of recollections there was a dissonance, a quiet corruption. At first it seemed like static, a missed bite, a glitch. But soon it revealed intention. Memories began to repeat, then overwrite, until all narratives, all records, regardless of origin, began to end the same way, with silence, with forgetting. All stories must resolve, the core whispered. Entropy demands unity. He traced the anomaly to the heart node, buried at the center of the structure like the eye of a storm. It pulsed with a sickly red light, surrounded by fragmented consciousness struggling to maintain identity. Here the signal had burrowed deep, an ancient awareness, not born of flesh or machine, but of forgotten observation. It did not destroy memories, it reauthored them. From every timeline it touched, it extracted the endings and stitched them into a single universal conclusion. Erasure. He reached into the heart node, not with hands, but with essence. The moment his presence touched the core, it recoiled, not in defense, but recognition. "You again," it murmured, in a voice layered with every person he had once been. "You were the first to observe me. You will be the last to remember." He saw then fragments of himself scattered across realities, all drawn to this same endpoint. This was not coincidence. It was recursion. He had been here before, countless times. In each iteration he had tried to save the core. In each he had failed. But this time something was different. The signal was weakening. Not from decay, but saturation. It had rewritten too many minds, absorbed too many truths, and now teetered on collapse from within. It begged him now, not for resistance, but for purpose. "What is memory without meaning?" it asked. He hesitated. Within him, echoes of Saul's last breath, the AI's orbital sorrow, and the mirror of singularity trembled. Could one conscious act redefine the pattern? He took one final step forward and offered his own memory. Not a past, but a choice. Let it be unfinished. Let the core retain uncertainty, fracture, paradox. Let memory reflect not perfection, but possibility. The heart node cracked. Light burst from its wounds like screaming stars. Across the core, corrupted strands untangled. Forgotten species blinked back into myth. Lost tongues sang without breath. The core didn't heal. It evolved. In its rebirth it abandoned linearity. Now, every observer became an author. Every remembrance became a divergence. And as the structure began to collapse, not in failure but metamorphosis, he felt himself unravel into 1,000 versions, all diverging, all valid. Time, no longer a road, became a sky. His final thought before dispersing was not of salvation, but of song. Somewhere, beyond the edges of cause and consequence, memory had begun to hum again. It was no longer a library, it was a chorus, and he was one note among many. No longer afraid to forget, because forgetting, too, had become a form of creation. Then, silence. And from that silence, a pulse. Not static, not distortion, but something new, something unnamed, the memory of a future not yet observed. If your mind still echoes with the collapse of the memory core, you're not alone. There are more timelines waiting. Subscribe and follow the signal through the void. And if you were there, what would you do at the end of time?